Yeah, Gigi, what I'm wondering is, if you thought, I agree with you, by the way, on lockdowns, and now I see that it was probably silly for, or it was very, the costs far exceeded the benefits for COVID. But could it be the case that for another virus or another, and say if we had, if we had the plague again, but I mean, thankfully we don't. That's not really a prospect. But if it was something worse than COVID, could lockdowns make sense then?
So that's also a really great question. I'm actually at the moment writing a paper together with Sanjeev Sablock and Paul Freiders, who I've both written with before, as you know,
Yeah.
about the history of quarantines, the history of quarantine policy, whether quarantines, lockdowns, basically, or cordon sanitaire, as they're called in French, whether they actually have a track record of working in response to other disease threats over the ages, including the Black Death and many other diseases as well. Now, what we are discovering, and this is really down to Sanjeev's amazing historical work, is that in fact, in the 1800s, there was a movement that developed based on the scant evidence that quarantines did anything positive and a huge amount of evidence that they were very destructive. There was a movement that developed called the Sanitarians movement, which aimed to basically beat quarantine as an idea out of the public health system and replace it with the idea that what we need to aim for in public health is clean water, clean streets, clean air, sanitary living conditions, basically.
Mm.
Because in such conditions, of course, as we now know, germs are less likely to thrive. You have lower viral loads. You have more health for individual people. It's just more immune supportive if you can breathe freely and fresh air and all this and drink clean water. So it's really about supporting the immunity of the people and reducing the load of the infectious agents, rather than separating people according to whether you think they've been exposed or not, or certainly in the case of COVID, even people you don't think have necessarily been exposed, just whole healthy populations, locking them down. That just that's not nearly as effective as the sanitary measures. So there was a figure called Charles McLean, who was an advocate in the sanitarian movement, and basically did a lot of the research showing that quarantines basically fail, and that really what they are, and this was the particularly interesting part of his work, that what they are is a tool for control that is often pressed upon populations by public health bureaucracies. So it's much more about, here is something we can do, and we can justify our jobs by having this thing in place. Because, I mean, my goodness, the bureaucracy and, COVIDocracy that grew up during the COVID era was pretty large. You had to hire more people and, get them to help you enforce these various policies on the population. But in terms of actual effect on disease, is pretty minimal. In my cost-benefit analysis, I estimate that maybe we extended the lives of maybe 10,000, mostly elderly and comorbid people, for a few years. That's what we got out of lockdowns. And what we paid for that was way more than the roughly $6 billion that in normal times we'd be willing to pay for that amount of benefit. That is to save a few live years of about 10,000 people. So, so basically quarantines or lockdowns do not have a good track record. And that was already embodied in the pre-2020 pandemic management plans in place, not only in Australia, but around the world in the West, that said, look, locking down whole populations is just very, very costly, unlikely to be beneficial. And so we should avoid it, and we should target protection measures instead. So basically, I like to tell people who say, well, what else were we supposed to do? Well, the question is, that lockdowns don't work. So what are you going to do? All right. Everybody's scared. You need to find something to do. So you don't run headlong into a speeding truck, which is what lockdowns are. That's what you don't do. Right. But of course, you have to take some action. Now, if you ask me, is there any disease that one could potentially create or imagine in one's head for which lockdowns might have more benefit than cost? I mean, even for the Black Death, it's questionable compared to the other things that could be done, sanitary measures, right? Compared to everything else we could do. It's not like we have let it rip versus lockdown. There's a whole spectrum of possible response. And we really didn't investigate that spectrum at all during COVID. So I think the answer is really, usually it's nuanced, it's customized to the disease in play. It should be updated as we learn more information about that disease, and it should be targeted to the people who are truly vulnerable.